Welcome to Chapter 3 on Racelighting. In this chapter, we will examine common messages that Racelighters use to convey racelighting messages to their racelightee. Racelighting is part of the everyday experiences that people of color have with racism. When racist messages are rendered to people of color, the veracity, persistence, and authenticity in which the messages are rendered increase the likelihood of disorienting the recipient. As a result, it is essential for BIPOC to understand common messages that may lead to racelighting. In the framework that you have on your screen, there are 4 different subtypes that lead to racelighting. These are common racelighting messages. These 4 messages include stereotype advancement, inauthentic allyship, misrepresenting the past, and resistive actions. Stereotype advancement refers to the deployment of stereotypes to frame perceptions of BIPOC, which can occur when discourse or conversation around BIPOC emphasizes falsehoods and stereotypes. Inauthentic allyship entails advancing the false pretense that a person or entity supports or will protect BIPOC when they in fact do not plan to do so. Misrepresenting the past refers to reframing historical injustices against people of color in ways that benefit white supremacy. And resistive actions are messages or behaviors that are meant to defend racelighters against personal racism or their role in racism. These actions are designed to protect and comfort racelighters and their allies at the expense of the racelitees.
There are a number of different common messages that are used to racelight BIPOC. We're going to talk about 4 of them within this program. The first are what we refer to as resistive actions. Resistive actions. The second that we're going to talk about is what are referred to as misrepresenting the past. And I'm sure you can immediately understand what that means. Misrepresenting, representing the past. The third is what we would refer to as stereotype advancement. And then the last is what we refer to as inauthentic allyship. Now, what we're going to do in this program is we're going to go into depth into what these actually mean so that you can have a full understanding of what this is. But let's first just really quickly kind of define them at a high level. So stereotype advancement is when someone uses stereotypes to frame perceptions of people of color. And specifically, these stereotypes can involve an assumption of criminality or deviant behavior, a lack of intelligence or capability, being a second-class citizen, being lesser than essentially, or being emotionally unstable. So this occurs when discourse about Black, Indigenous, and people of color emphasizes falsehoods and stereotypes that are common about them and leverages these stereotypes to undermine, to question, and to frame them. And so this is a key type of way in which messages about BIPOC are rendered in a way that lead them to second guess themselves and even to believe these stereotypes and narratives. In addition to that, we also have what is called inauthentic allyship. Inauthentic allyship. We could also call this performative allyship. And this refers to advancing the pretense that a person, particularly a white person or a non-person of color, supports or intends to protect a BIPOC when they actually indeed do not. They neither support, they neither intend to protect, but they create a narrative that suggests that they do. It's when someone says that they're committed to people of color when they really aren't. It's when they say that they're committed to making more action in the lives of people of color than they really plan to. It's when they say that they're doing more to advance people of color than they really actually are. In addition to this, we can also have what's called misrepresenting the past. Misrepresenting the past refers to framing historical injustices against people of color in ways that benefit white supremacy. It can be perpetuating falsehoods that present people in a positive light, or avoiding histories that present majority racial groups in a negative light. So there's been things that have been done that are past injustices, and we're going to avoid presenting those histories. Or it can even be reducing and or erasing the contributions of people of color in terms of their contribution to significant historical advances that are oftentimes ignored, glossed over, or just simply left out of the history books or of the curriculum. These messages can also serve to Racelight BIPOC. And lastly, they can be resistive actions that are meant to defend the perpetrator, the person who is the Racelighter or Racelighters, against accusations of racism or their role in racism. And this can be essentially a defensive posture that people take, meant to protect themselves or comfort themselves, either among the Racelighter themselves, to protect or comfort them, or to inoculate themselves from perceptions of racism from others who are around them in their environment. It is the combination, of course, of these four frames that serve to create an experience for BIPOC that leads them to feel, in a sense, that they are being race-lighted.
Stereotype advancement involves framing perceptions around people of color to themselves and to others through the use of stereotypes. Given our attention to assumptions of criminality, ascriptions of intelligence, second-class citizenship, and pathologizing culture in previous module, we have focused on highlighting stereotypes related to those microaggressions. That being said, this is not an exhaustive list of stereotypes, but is demonstrative. There are numerous stereotypes about people of color, and anytime those stereotypes are advanced, they can race-light BIPOC. One common stereotype about BIPOC is that they are prone to criminality. Daryl Ring Sue, in his description of racial microaggressions, calls this an assumption of criminality. When people of color based on their race are assumed to be troublemakers, dangerous, deviant, up to no good, or to have some form of malintent, this is an example of assumption of criminality. These stereotypes are often attributed to negative outcomes in social institutions. For example, stereotypes about Black youth that assume that they are deviants and problems is associated with the overexposure of Black children to exclusionary disciplines such as suspensions, expulsions, and the use of restraint. It is also a stereotype that BIPOC are less intelligent and are capable in comparison to their peers. Sue refers to this as ascriptions of intelligence, when we assign a degree of intelligence to a person based on their race. Stereotypical depictions of BIPOC in the media often depict them as emanating from families and communities that are less than ideal. These portrayals often depict people of color as lesser than or less desirable than their peers. Sue refers to this treatment as second-class citizenship. In addition, BIPOC can be portrayed as emotionally unstable, angry, brooding, and histrionic. These depictions of emotional instability are designed to inhibit trust in what they have to say, especially when people of color are voicing concerns about racial and gendered mistreatment. Racelighters understand the power of these stereotypes, and whether they do so with intention or unconsciously, they use these messages to race-light BIPOC. Thus, stereotype advancement occurs when discourse around BIPOC emphasizes falsehoods and stereotypes. This means that the Racelighter frames the actions of a person of color to them in ways that draw upon stereotypes and emphasize false narratives around who they are, their intentions, their motivations, etc. However, Racelighters can also paint a picture about a target to other individuals. They can draw on these stereotypes to portray their victims through narratives that align with stereotypes. Because of this alignment, the messages themselves may seem more plausible and truthful because they reside within narratives that are often familiar with and tacitly believed in by others. In total, Racelighters leverage stereotypes to undermine, question, and frame BIPOC in ways that are advantageous for their own personal ends. As was mentioned, we have highlighted four predominant stereotypes: prone to criminality, less intelligence, lesser than, and emotionally unstable. However, there are numerous stereotypes that Racelighters use that are not addressed here. So let's explore some examples of these 4 types of stereotype advancement. Advancing narratives that BIPOC are prone to criminality, less intelligent or capable, lesser than, and or are emotionally unstable. Prone to criminality refers to extending the narrative that people of color are troublemakers and or represent an existential threat. Racelighters will extend stereotypes about others using narratives that frame people of color as troublemakers, deviants, prone to cutting corners, aggressive, defiant, deregulated, and problems. Let's look at some of the examples of this. In these examples, Racelighter refers to the person who is the perpetrator, the person who is conveying the racelighting message to the other individual. In contrast, the Racelighter E refers to the person who is being victimized by them. Let's look at an example of this. A Racelighter, in this case, let's assume that it's another person's boss. They say, "We aren't going to get the grant in on time now because you didn't get us your part." The Racelight E, "You told me we had till next week," which based upon their conversation was true. The Racelighter says, "That's not true, just be truthful." In reality, they knew that it was truthful, but they were extending a false narrative. Or let's look at another example. A Racelighter says, "I didn't say you could use my card." The Racelighter, "Yes, you did. You sent me a text yesterday." The Racelighter, "Yes, but then we talked after that and I said not to do so." The Racelighter, feeling confused, says, "Huh? And when?" and begins to second guess themselves. In the examples on your screen, we look at messages that a Racelighter might say to a person of color to demonstrate how stereotypes of criminality are employed by Racelighters. In all these cases, the Racelighter is conveying a message that proactively frames to a person of color that they are a criminal. This is a distorted reality. It can include a Racelighter saying, "You're not very expressive at work. People think you are unwelcoming and out to get them." Another person might say, "I know you're dealing with a lot in your family. You can't keep showing up late and not accounting for your time on your time card," when in reality, they've been showing up on time. A Racelighter says, "You're making students uncomfortable with your discussions on race." Or says, "I hope you aren't cutting corners because your efforts seem to be moving forward rather quickly. That beneath their excellence at work is an ethos that cuts corners." And lastly, "You said you reviewed this document twice. Are you sure you did?" Making the Racelighter begin to question their own memory. The next set of messages focus on the messages that Racelighters will also send to a targeted individual's colleagues in order to create a sense or aura around them. This serves to frame a larger narrative around this individual that is reinforced through other people. This could include a Racelighter intentionally spreading partial information about a personnel matter to frame a person of color as a troublemaker employee, as someone who cuts corners, creates issues where there aren't any, doesn't follow protocols, etc. This, of course, is to frame the individual to others as being a problem. Or a Racelighter could say to a person's colleagues, "Be careful with him. You don't know if he has a record or not." Or to create an environment for potential racial conflict, saying to one's colleagues, "Be careful, she will call us racist and destroy our careers." Or characterizing a successful employee in negative terms, saying, "He is not strategic, he is manipulative and cuts corners." Again, framing these stereotypes around criminality in order to create an aura around a particular individual who is their target. In addition to advancing stereotypes that people of color are prone to criminality, Racelighters can also extend stereotypes associated with an ascription of intelligence, where a degree of intelligence is assigned to a person based on their race. Racelighters advance this notion, usually conveying that BIPOC are less intelligent or capable, which refers to extending the narrative people of color are less intelligent, qualified, experienced, and are capable. This could include ignoring the ideas or contributions of people of color in meetings and work groups, or asserting to a person of color who rarely makes mistake and is a model employee, "You keep having errors like this in your document. I don't know how we're going to manage this." Or instilling doubt in a recipient by saying, "Wow, do you think you'll be able to manage their project on your own? We know that's been an issue before when there are no prior issues." Or it could be a Racelighter saying to a Racelighter, "Why didn't you send the email out?" The Racelighter responds, "You told me I didn't need to," which was based upon the last directive that they had received. The Racelighter is aware that they gave the Racelighter this directive, but still says, "That's not what I said." You have to think more quickly in this role. This makes the Racelighter question whether they missed something. Over the next several days, the Racelighter will intentionally emphasize this same message about them not thinking quickly enough, being sharp, being slow to learn information, not catching information on fast enough. Now let's examine some common examples of race lighting that occur in higher education for faculty members of color. The following racial microaggressions can serve to sow doubt in one's capabilities. They include a race lighter saying to a race lightee, "You've only got this position because of your background. There are more other qualified candidates." Or people of color get more scholarships. It's because of the look. You get funding for your research because of your focus on minorities. Or you only get published because you're in Black journals. The research you do isn't rigorous enough because of its focus on minorities. In all of these cases, the intelligence and capability of the person of color, in this case, the faculty of color, is being questioned in a way that can lead them to feel as if maybe there is some truth behind what is being said, when in fact, they're really just experiencing race lighting. A third common race lighting message that BIPOC face are being treated as lesser than, which refers to being perceived, their culture, communication, values, the community they come from, the school you come from, your family, as being lesser than or second class. This is aligned directly with Daryl Wing Su's notion of second-class citizenship. These messages convey to BIPOC that they are lowly, not of worth, are culturally lazy, and other erroneous stereotypes. Some examples could include someone saying, "You don't really add more value here," or "Immigrants are lazy and only come here for free social services. You don't seem to care. You don't seem very committed to this organization. Are you here for the company or just for the benefits? Are you committed to the success of your child? You don't seem to be." These messages frame the values and the communication styles of people of color as being less than ideal, as being lesser than. Pathologizing one's community can also be part of this. Other examples of race lighting can include characterizing the neighborhoods that people of color were raised in as being dangerous or in a bad part of town, or in some way bad or negative. Someone could say, "Didn't you grow up in X part of town," referring to the part of town that they were raised in, and then referring to that part of town as scary or what. Or a teacher routinely skipping over a child of color in the classroom to attend to other children in the classroom who are deemed as worthy of their time investment. Oftentimes, those are the students who look like the vast majority of teachers. This can also transcend to physical presentation. Idara Estien's article, "I Love My Hair," serves as an apt example of the messages the Black girls receive about their hair, with statements like, "Oh, is this your natural hair? Very interesting." Again, making them feel like they are lesser than and making them question their own physical attributes. Obviously, said in a negative way or negative tone, these messages can malign a community. They come from communities that don't tend to prioritize learning, suggesting that there are other priorities that are lesser than, that are less than ideal, when in fact, of course, their communities do indeed care about learning. This is examples of how people of color can be treated as lesser than. Another stereotype commonly advanced by Racelighters are that BIPOC are emotionally unstable. This refers to being viewed as being unable to regulate one's emotions and decorum in appropriate ways. These messages portray Racelighters and others as having extreme emotions, being overly stoic or angry, emotionally withdrawn, dramatic, overly loud, standoffish, bossy, unkind, and that they don't smile. These messages undermine the experiences, perceptions, and voice of people of color, especially when trying to address issues of race and racism in the work environment. Examples of this could include a Racelighter saying, "You know, people see you as being overly loud," or "Why don't you smile more? You come off as defensive," or "You know, when you ask people for agenda items, it comes off as bossy. When you stand up, when you present, people think it comes off as aggressive. Why do you always have to blow these issues into a larger deal than they actually are? If you could be a little less expressive, it would be better with this audience." In all these cases, the message from the Racelighter is intended to lead the Racelightee to question themselves, to doubt their emotions, to doubt their actions, and to frame a reality that is different from what actually occurred. Other examples of this could include, "When you disagreed with me, it came off as threatening," or "People interpreted your response as an outburst. Are you okay? I hope you are getting help for what you're going through. People are noticing that your behavior is changing." Asking a person of color to leave out of a meeting with the client because they may ruin the relationship. Or saying to them, "I'm just checking on you. You seem angry today. Are you okay? I didn't say their actions were okay. Why are you being so angry? Again, the focus here is on undermining the legitimacy of the Racelight. This makes the message more believable for the Racelight and for others with whom they regularly engage. While there are certainly more examples of how Racelighters can advance stereotypes that lead BIPOC to doubt themselves, we have offered 4 types that we believe are common: being prone to criminality, less intelligent or capable, being perceived as lesser than or unstable. And ultimately, these race-lighting messages convey an underlying message that you are a criminal, you are dangerous, you're not smart, you don't belong here, you're not experienced enough, you're not good enough, you don't care, you don't work hard, you're volatile, and you make others feel uncomfortable. These messages can accumulate in a way that can make Black, Indigenous, and people of color begin to doubt themselves in ways that are detrimental to their success. Now that we have talked about stereotype advancement, the next type of common race-lighting messages we'd like to examine is inauthentic allyship. Inauthentic allyship involves incidents when race-lighters present themselves as wanting to protect or support people of color, but their actions do not align with their espoused values. Inauthentic allyship refers to advancing the pretense that a person or entity supports or protects people of color when they do not. This could include saying that we are committed to people of color when they are not, saying they are committed to making more action to improve the lives of people of color more than they plan to, or saying they are doing more to advance people of color than they actually are. The underlying theme is one of failing to help, advance, help protect, or support people of color. So there are at least 2 different types of inauthentic allyship, what some people call performative actions: a pretense of protection and a semblance of support. Let's first look at a pretense of protection. A pretense of protection refers to perpetuating a false narrative of protection for people of color. This could include doing something bad to a person of color and pretending like it was done to help them or to protect them, or telling a person of color you will speak on their behalf if anything negative about them comes up in a conversation, and then failing to do so when issues are raised. An individual tearing down the credibility of a person of color while simultaneously telling them they are fighting for them behind the scenes, or saying to a person of color, you know, people think you are difficult to work with, but don't worry, I'm telling them otherwise, when they really are not telling them anything that disaligns with that narrative and are in fact perpetuating that narrative. Inauthentic allyship can also involve a semblance of support. This refers to perpetuating a false narrative of support to people of color. This could include a range of actions like pretending to want to create change, but not taking the critical actions necessary to do so, or supporting a person of color's views and perspectives in private, but not in public, or touting oneself as an advocate for equity while actively marginalizing and silencing the people of color with whom one works, or an espoused commitment to diversity, but no efforts to recruit, retain, or promote faculty of color, or when a department tells a person of color that they are on track to receive tenure, which is then followed by letters of opposition to their tenure, a narrative which disaligned with the actuality. Other examples could include telling Black voters what they want to hear with no intention of following through, a high-ranking official pretending like they're going to fund schools more equitably, but not having any plan to do so, or giving a symbolic victory instead of making real change, or even university statements of support after nationally known racial incidents without any plan of action. This last example, I'd like to stay here for just a moment. After the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, college and university leaders across the nation released statements of solidarity to the respective campus communities. These statements were extended as a heartfelt expression of unity from senior leaders, heralding the institution's awareness and commitment to diversity. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, campuses released messages highlighting their solidarity with the Black community, saying, "We stand with the Black community," noting the institution's desire to hear from their Black and African-American communities, saying, "We want to listen, we are listening." Their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a hard stance rejecting anti-Black racism, and the institution's commitment to fostering climates of belonging. When crafted with authentic intentions and strategic actions, these statements can be powerful affirmations of community. In contrast, inauthentic intentions in the absence of meaningful next steps are race-lighting statements. These statements do just as much harm to people of color and their communities as institutions do when they decide not to release a statement at all. Regardless of the impetus, campuses routinely release statements. In spite of the reason why a campus decides to offer a statement of solidarity, they're often met with a range of responses from people of color. For some people of color, these statements serve as a source of hope and a belief that the perils that they have endured will finally be addressed. For these individuals, there is anticipation of action to come, which may not come, which will likely not come. For other people of color, these statements feel inauthentic and performative. They are motivated to control an evolving situation, to pretend there is a greater institutional commitment to diversity than there really is, to appease a constituency, or simply to avoid condemnation for not releasing a statement at all. Yet for others, these statements indicate a temporary focus on efforts in response to a crisis. There's an expectation that there may be some limited focus on a particular issue, and thus there's a need to maximize the moment before it passes. Regardless of the responses, more often than not, these statements rarely result in sustainable actions that bring substantive change in the experiences of people of color and other educators. This is race-lighting. There are some common underlying messages that are communicated to people of color when inauthentic allyship or performative actions are in place. It communicates to people of color that they are crazy, that there's something that's wrong with them, that they are the problem, that they aren't good enough or smart enough. It instills doubt in oneself and one's emotional safety and security. So far, we have addressed two common messages that are used to race-light people of color. These include stereotype advancement and inauthentic allyship. Now we turn our attention to misrepresenting the past. This includes actions that misrepresent past advances by or injustices against people of color. This can include positive false histories, erasure of past injustices, and downplaying contributions of people of color. Misrepresenting the past refers to framing historical injustices against people of color in ways that benefit white supremacy. This involves three major actions: perpetuating false histories in ways that present white people in a positive light, avoiding the discussion or presentation of histories that present majority racial groups in a negative light, and reducing and or erasing the contributions of people of color to historical advances. So let's briefly explore each of these: positive false histories, erasure of past injustices, and downplaying contributions. Certainly, there are important contributions that all people groups have made to history. The Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian, and Asian American communities and white communities have all made important contributions to society. However, there remains a tendency for dominant groups to frame history in ways that are advantageous for them. As a result, it is not uncommon for white Eurocentric history to present false and embellished narratives that present white people in a positive light when information is misleading or simply inaccurate. Thus, positive false histories refer to perpetuating false histories that present white people in a positive light. This could include a history book only presenting the good stories about white history, thus playing up the good without context to the challenges of the times, asserting that a slave owner was a good man and just a product of his times, or simply a business owner, not acknowledging the moral values that they violated, stating that Columbus was the first person to discover America when the land itself was already inhabited by native peoples, or saying back when there was a good old American values, an appeal to history that's akin to make America great again, and ignoring a history of segregation and oppression by asserting back in the day, your word meant something, as a way of appealing to history in this positive sense. Another way to misrepresent the past is to erase past injustices. Erasure of past injustices refers to avoiding histories that present majority racial groups in a negative light. So issues of slavery, genocide, systemic inequities, legal racism are simply ignored. They could include statements like, the past was better than you admit, or the past wasn't as bad as you say, or this nation doesn't have a racist past. It could also include history books that omit atrocities carried out by white communities on communities of color. Or a Racelighter could say, slavery wasn't that bad. There were people who came here as indentured servants. Ultimately, they are misrepresenting the past in order to reframe the future and the current context as being different than it actually is. It could also include discussing the successes of World War II without acknowledging the ills of Japanese internment, or stating things aren't as bad as they once were, or talking about the history of land-grant institutions without acknowledging that the land was unceded native land. In each of these cases, past crimes are played down. Some of these examples may, of course, resonate with those in states where academic freedom on critical race theory and the 1619 Project are under attack. A third type of misrepresenting the past is downplaying contributions. This refers to reducing and or erasing the contributions of people of color to historical advances. This could include omitting the histories of people of color in school curriculum, saying people of color want to rewrite history, discussing the building of a nation's capital without mentioning the Black workers who worked to build it, discussing white inventors in history while ignoring their people of color co-inventors. In each of these cases, the contributions of people of color are downplayed and ignored in order to fortify a history which misrepresents the past. In all, positive false histories, erasure of past injustices, and downplaying contributions produces a number of underlying messages conveying to BIPOC, you are imagining things. You are making this into a larger deal. You don't contribute to anything. You misunderstand what occurred, or you misunderstood what occurred. You are rewriting the past. We made this world better without you. We were more moral in the past, and we have only done great things. These underlying messages are false in that they are disaligned with what actually took place in the past. The final common area of race-lighting messages that we will explore in this program are resistive actions. These are actions that resist acknowledging the impact of race and racism on BIPOC. Resistive actions are defined as actions meant to defend the perpetrator against personal racism or one's role in racism. These actions are meant to protect the perpetrator and comfort the perpetrator's allies. These actions resist accountability for racism and racist behaviors in 5 primary ways. First, through a denial of racism, reverse causality or victim blaming, claims of reverse racism, reverse discrimination, avoidance of accountability, and public declarations of incompetence. According to Sue, 2007, denial of individual racism occurs when white people deny their own biases and racism in reference to BIPOC. This is described as occurring when statements of equivalence are made. An example could be a white woman noting that people of color should feel comfortable expressing concerns to them because they experience discrimination too. As Sue noted, racial discrimination is simply different and statements of equivalency do not need to be met. Another example of denial of individual racism is when people of color bring an issue of subtle racism or overt racism to the attention of a perpetrator, and they denied what occurred. Statements such as, what I said wasn't racist, or it wasn't cultural appropriation, it was honoring their culture, or that's not what I said, I think you are misunderstanding the situation, are all examples of denial of individual racism. When racism is denied, it can serve to race-light people of color by conveying that they have misheard something, that they are falsely assuming someone has the responsibility to intercede, or that they do not understand a situation fully, or even that they are being overly sensitive. Other examples of denial of racism could include stating, that's not racism, that's just how they treat everyone, or things have gotten far better than they used to be, or their actions aren't as bad as their predecessors were. Those issues are important, but what about class issues and the climate? Or it was a joke, can't we do that anymore? Well, research shows that Black people do commit more crimes, where I think you're blowing this issue out of proportion. In each of these cases, all of these messages are really microaggressions that can serve to disorient people of color. These statements are disingenuous and deny the Racelighties' experience with race and racism. Reverse causality refers to assuming that a person of color is the locus of a problem or an issue. This concept is sometimes called victim blaming, where someone is blamed for their own misfortunes, a strategy often used against victims of sexual assault who are blamed for their own attacks. People of color can be blamed for racism. The media uses this strategy commonly to negatively frame men of color whose lives are lost to police violence. In such cases, stereotypical information can be released to the public, resulting in public placing higher levels of fault and blame on the victim and lower levels of empathy. Similarly, in education, people of color can be blamed for racism with statements such as, if the student had only complied with security, or why aren't you trusting them? You really need to be more collaborative. Or people would treat you kinder if you smiled more. And what did you do to cause this to occur? messages conveying a reverse causality race-like people of color by conveying to them that they are the problem, that they deserve their mistreatment, and they are the reason for the bad outcomes that they experience. Another subtype of resistive actions are claims of reverse racism. This refers to advancing the notion that majority groups are those that are being oppressed. As noted by Nolan Cabrera, when this focus shifts to racially privileged white students, the waters become murkier because the very markers of racial inclusion can be seen as examples of racial exclusion. As a result, narratives can be shifted intentionally to assert that people of color receive advantages, benefits, and priorities not received by those who are white. In essence, majority groups who have access to power and privilege are those who are being oppressed. There are numerous examples of errant claims of reverse racism, such as programs designed to serve people of color, scholarships specific to people of color, recruitment practices that target people of color intentionally. In these cases, the goal of these efforts is to reduce significant disparities due to systemic racism and white supremacy. Statements made to people of color that communicate claims of reverse racism can include messages that you are the one who's being racist, or you are bullying us by trying to bring up race, or white people are the ones who are having a hard time right now getting into college, or only minorities get scholarship. And this whole focus on racial equity means we don't care about white people. These messages serve to Racelight recipients by conveying that they are the locus of the problem, that they don't understand, and that they are the ones who are not being logical. Avoidance of accountability is another subtype of resistive actions, which refers to actions to avoid accountability or involvement in racial issues altogether. This can involve simply avoiding issues of racism when they arise, akin to a bystander not being an upstander, or transferring the responsibility to intercede in a racial issue to people of color. Previously, we have referred to this as transference or avoidance of racial intervention, when white people avoid or transfer responsibility for intervening when racial injustices occur to those who are experiencing the actual injustice, people of color. Such messages can race-like people of color, conveying to them that they are overblowing an issue because nothing is wrong, that the issue is not important enough to get involved in, or that maybe there is some truth for the reasons that they're being oppressed, and therefore they're not going to get into the middle of it. These messages are detrimental to the mental well-being of people of color, especially when a lack of inaction occurs from individuals who describe themselves as allies. The final example that we have of a resistive action is that of public declarations of incompetence. According to Sean Harper, public declarations of incompetence refer to declaring a lack of understanding and knowledge about issues of race and racism. Such statements are made consciously and unconsciously to immune oneself from being responsible for racist actions and inactions. One example of this could be a white person using a racist word or outdated terms and then saying that they should not be held responsible for these words because they were not aware of what is up to date or politically correct language. When educators declare their incompetence around issues of race and racism publicly, it counters the expectations that they have for the very students that they teach. For instance, classroom educators require students to learn new models, theories, and ideas. They ask them to convey their learning through tests, papers, and simulations. They highlight the need to maintain rigor, excellence, and standards for students' learning, growth, and development. Yet, when it comes to issues of race and racism, similar expectations and standards and ongoing learning are seemingly lost. Numerous examples of messages that can serve as public declarations of incompetence are evident. They can include, I didn't know what that word or phrase meant, or we haven't got a lot of Black students here, so I don't know how to do what you're asking me to do. Or I grew up in an all-white community, so I'm not really sure how you want me to support them. Or I'm not sure what to say. I just don't want to say the wrong thing. Or I'm white. I'm not sure how to talk about these issues of race. These messages race-like people of color by conveying to them that nothing is wrong, that they have overblown expectations, that they are being overly sensitive and misrepresenting the intentions, and also simply just not understanding enough. As noted by Daryl Wing Sue, racial microaggressions often convey two different meanings from what is said and what is meant. For example, a person of color may be told with a sense of surprise, oh, wow, you're so articulate. However, what is meant is I didn't think you would be because of your race. Moreover, a student of color can be asked for an ID on campus at nighttime, the underlying meaning being that we think you're here to steal something. Similarly, race lighting messages are racial microaggressions that lead people of color to question themselves by conveying a dual meaning. The dual meanings across the categories of resistive actions communicate to people of color that you are the problem. Nothing is wrong here. That's not what I said. That's not what I meant, or you don't understand. That's not what I heard. That's not what research says. Well, I think that it's not me. I don't know. That's not my responsibility. And I'm not getting in the middle of that. These messages serve to disorient people of color, leading them to feel delusional. This feeling occurs whether there is intent on the part of the perpetrator or perpetrators, such as active race lighting or passive race lighting. Regardless, it race lights the recipient. Thank you for joining us for Chapter 3 on common messages that race lighters use. In the final chapter, we will talk about strategies for improvement, what we can do to ensure a better environment for people of color. Thank you.